Hello, this is the lady Ms. Vagina Jenkins coming to you in voiceover, and it's time for queer astrology. I thought that I would devote the month of October, which is Hoodoo Heritage Month, to significant historical figures and astrological events that are significant in Hoodoo culture. As I record this particular video, it is October 2nd, which is the 223rd birthday of Nathaniel Nat Turner, born October 2nd, 1800. Let's talk about Nat Turner, his life, his history, and his legacy, and let's look at the astrology chart associated with his rebellion. This biographical information comes from an Instagram account called TheHoodooCalendar, and I'll be sure to tag them and put their information in the description box below. King Nat was a seer, prophet, preacher, and freedom fighter who used his intuitive gifts to spearhead one of the greatest slave rebellions in U.S. history, one that would shift the trajectory of Black lives under the Ma'afa for decades to come. King Nat was born enslaved on the Benjamin Turner plantation in Southampton County, Virginia. He was a highly intuitive and gifted child. He could easily recall events that took place in his life as early as 3 or 4 years old. He also foretold events that occurred before his time. His grandmother was a deeply spiritual elder who nurtured his spiritual development. His mother and their peers knew that he would become a prophet and was surely destined for a higher purpose. For his uncommon intelligence, Nat learned to read and write at a young age, which also indoctrinated him into Christianity. His interpretation of the Christian Bible convinced him that the Christian God condemned slavery. This inspired him to become a preacher. And then there's a quote from Nat Turner from the book Confessions of Nat Turner. I had a vision, and I saw white spirits and black spirits engaged in battle, and the sun was darkened. The thunder rolled in the heavens, and blood flowed in streams, and I heard a voice saying, quote, "Such is your luck. Such are you called to see, and let it come, rough or smooth, you must surely bear it." The following information is about Nat Turner's rebellion, and that is taken from the Ohio State University's website, an article called Nat Turner and the Fear of African Spirituality. On the warm, late summer night of August 21st, 1831, Nat Turner embarked on a crusade of insurrection and freedom which descended upon Southampton County, Virginia, at the plantation owned by Joseph Travis. Nat Turner, believing he had been directed to his mission through spiritual command and intervention, proclaimed himself to be a savior of his people and proceeded to gather and recruit members of Mr. Travis's plantation, as well as those adjacent to the Travis estate. Inspired by a spiritual fervor which was imparted to him by his mother, who was captured and brought to America from Africa, Nat Turner believed that he had been specifically ordained to obtain his freedom through the slaughtering of any white person who came into his path. Nat Turner's march through Southampton County began following an eclipse of the sun, which was taken as a sign from God that what he was embarking on was divinely directed. So let's look at some charts. On the left here, I have Nat Turner's chart, except for we don't have an exact birth time, and so I didn't want to look at the full natal wheel, and instead of the full natal wheel, we are just looking at a list of placements and trying to really hard, which is difficult for me, to not put them into houses and speculate what houses they are in. So that's a reminder that I'm going to try to hold for myself during this little talk. And then, yeah, this middle chart is the eclipse that let Nat Turner know that the time was nigh to really start acting on possible plans, thoughts, ideas that he had been having about revolution. This was a solar eclipse on the new moon of August 7th, 1831. In some papers that I read, he talked about being inspired by the events of the eclipse and thinking that his thoughts about revolution were ordained by God, based on the sky changing in this way. And yeah, though this eclipse was barely visible, it apparently turned the sky an odd greenish color, which he took as a sign to begin, or at least really concretely start planning his rebellion. And then this third chart here is the moment that the rebellion began, which was at 2 a.m. on August 22nd in Southampton, Virginia. So yeah, these are the three charts that I have pulled up, and I've noted just some interesting things that I wanted to point out. And so I speculate that Nat Turner was some kind of cardinal sign rising. A lot of his story is centered around people thinking that he was some sort of spiritual leader, and particularly a leader of the people, and that he was of above average intelligence and an amazing orator and researcher. And so I'm imagining, yes, some type of cardinal sign as a rising sign, but I think it must be air sign in particular. And yeah, the cardinal air sign is Libra. So I'm wondering about, Libra risingness. Even though I told myself I wasn't going to get into the houses, but that is just something that I think about. And so, yeah, if he were Libra rising, then that would put his Saturn in Leo in the 11th house. He would have just finished up his Saturn return. He was 30 years old at the time of the rebellion. And I mention all of that because I look here in this second chart of the eclipse, and I see that the North Node transit, and just generally speaking, the eclipse in general would have activated his Saturn in Leo. And so Saturn is often about like the ways in which we need to take responsibility, or maybe even like lessons that we need to learn. But I'm thinking more in the context of responsibility because Saturn in Leo is asking us to step up and take leadership in some way. And then, yeah, the eclipse happening in the sign of Leo is going to bring about fated events for anybody in the Leo area of their chart. And so for Nat Turner, I'm thinking about a Leo 11th house, since 11th house is the place of our social groups that we belong to, or our friend groups, basically the way that we fit into society. And so, yes, definitely fated events around the groups that he belonged to, and the way in which he might have been asked or tasked with stepping into the responsibility of leadership in some kind of way. Um, so yeah, that's one of the first things that jumped out at me when I was looking at just the chart for the eclipse and then comparing it to what we know of his birth placements. It's also interesting to note that Mars had just entered into Virgo around this time. Mars in Virgo is very much about planning, making the perfect plan. Sometimes, in a negative kind of way, it can be that my plan is so perfect that we must stick with my plan, and I don't necessarily take outside feedback very well. But Mars is just Mars in Virgo really just wants to execute the most efficient way of doing things. It's very organized. It's very much like cross the T's, dot the I's type energy. And so, yeah, with Mars just crossing over from Leo into Virgo, I wonder if this really sparked the idea of making the plan. It's also interesting to think about, like, if he were Libra rising, then that would put the Virgo or the Mars in Virgo transit in his 12th house. And so, they say that he was very spiritually connected. 12th house is the house of spirit. So, what would it have been like for him to be receiving messages, Mercury in his 12th house, transiting his 12th house? Uh, what would it have been like for him to be receiving messages from spirit about the perfect plan? So those are some of my noticings just as it relates to the eclipse. Now let's look at this third chart, which is the exact moment that the rebellion or revolt began. And this was the first chart that I thought to research. And upon opening it, it just immediately made me tear up. Um, it's just it's such a really interesting chart, I'll say. So the first thing that jumps out to me is the Cancer rising nature of this rebellion. This was a rebellion based on, yes, cardinal type of leadership, but leadership based on a deep emotional connection and being deeply emotionally invested in the mission. Cancer is very much centered on family, ancestry, understanding our ancestral foundations. And so this endeavor has the vibe of being ancestrally ordained, um, I believe, because of that Cancer rising. Um, it's difficult though because the Cancer risingness of the rebellion is directly in opposition to Neptune, retrograding Neptune in Capricorn. Um, so when I think about Capricorn, I think about the structures, the big governmental bodies, the ways in which society structures itself. I think about big business, I think about capitalism. And so Neptune in Capricorn, Neptune hates being in Capricorn. It cannot do its job of dreaming and connecting to spirit very easily. And so I wonder about during, the difference between being sparked by spiritual communication and then when it actually came down to the day of executing the plan, um, if he was able to connect to spirit in that way. And then just from like the perspective of looking at this as the idea of toppling a huge structure like the institution of slavery, um, how much of it was a dream and how much of it was a delusion or an illusion, with Neptune not being able to function properly. What I will say is that what if the goal were to somehow change the institution of slavery irrevocably? I definitely could see that the hierarchy, the slave owners in power, had the veil lifted from their eyes. They had the illusion that they had a positive relationship with the people that they were enslaving, ripped away from them. There was no way after this rebellion that they would be able to think that the people that they had enslaved were willing participants in their enslavement. Um, and it's funny because after this rebellion, there were a lot of laws changed based on uh, realizing those truths and having those illusions stripped away. The ways in which they just became so much more difficult. or so much more violent towards enslaved people, and created a whole system of laws based on having that illusion stripped away. Another interesting thing to note is that the North Node was in Leo and the Sun was in Leo at the exact moment of the rebellion's start, and that would have been activating and in a loose conjunction with Nat Turner's Saturn in Leo at 20 degrees. And so, yeah, if the North Node expands things where it is, and if the Sun provides energy and vitality to wherever it sits, and the Sun is in its home sign of Leo, would that have given him an even greater sense of responsibility in terms of stepping up into leadership in this endeavor? It's also interesting to note that a lot of planning went into this, a lot of conversation, a lot of thought. We've got the 12th house in Gemini, and usually when I'm looking at an event of some sort, I think about the 12th house as the time that preceded the event. And so, yeah, this is a lot of research, a lot of thought, a lot of conversations that went into planning this rebellion. I also see here in the third house of communication that we have Mars and Saturn in Virgo, and Mercury, which is in its home in Virgo. So, yeah, a lot of planning, a lot of ideating, a lot of communication and conversations went into creating this plan. Yeah, this Mars and Virgo energy is very much about let's create the perfect plan, um, going over the details over and over and over again. So yeah, there was definitely a lot of planning, a lot of communication energy that went into creating the idea of the rebellion. It's also interesting to note that the sun was in 28 degrees of Leo. 28 degrees of any sign is typically considered the fame degree. And this is it's the most famous, the greatest rebellion of enslaved people on American soil. Like the Nat Turner Rebellion is the most well known slave revolt in history. So definitely the fame part of it is something that stuck, and it's here in the second house. And so, what is it famous for? Is it famously the death knell of the economic institution of slavery? If we think about the second house being about how we earn our money, or maybe even our values around uh, material resources. And this was definitely a famous endeavor that was one of the many nails in the coffin that ended slavery, or the institution of slavery as we know it economically in America. The rebellion happened in 1831, and the emancipation happened in 1865. Last thing that I'll say in terms of noticings about the intersections between the chart for the rebellion and Nat Turner's chart um, is that at the moment of the rebellion, he had Venus in a close conjunction with his sun in Libra. And so, just the idea again of leading with love, that I think in the history books, especially from a white supremacist perspective, that the Nat Turner Rebellion is written as if it were a revolt, a murderous band of black people angry for no reason, murdering and killing mindlessly. Couldn't be further from the truth when I look at the chart for the actual rebellion. Uh, Again, the Cancer rising nature of the rebellion, this is definitely rooted in caring for one's family, and understanding the pain of one's ancestors and what they experienced. And there's this part here with the Venus in Libra, which would have been in a close transiting conjunction with Nat Turner's sun in Libra at 8 degrees here. And so, yeah, his motivations in this moment that the rebellion began were not about just being murderous or violent as white supremacists would have written it. They were motivated, or he was motivated rather, by love and a deep, abiding love and wanting to see balance and wanting to see equality for his people in the world. And that feels really beautiful to me. Yeah. So those are my noticings about Nat Turner's chart, the chart of the eclipse that it inspired him to plan the rebellion, and Nat Turner's August August 22, 1831 rebellion. Um, I'm so grateful that he lived, that I get to know his story, and that I get to celebrate him on his birthday. Um, Thank you so much, as always, for listening to me ramble about things that feel really important and special to me. Thank you for being a part of my special interests. If you've made it this far, thank you for respecting and honoring Hoodoo history and Hoodoo heritage. And as always, thank you for making time for queer astrology.